Hello and welcome to Simple Biblical Hebrew. It's good to be with you today. It's good to be doing a video together. We haven't done a lesson in a long time, and some of you have asked why. And maybe we can get into some of that perhaps at another time. But today we want to look at what are Hebrew diacritics. What are Hebrew diacritics? Now, I did make a video on this some time ago, and so I'm sort of redoing that video. I hope that if you are interested in learning more here at Simple Biblical Hebrew, make a comment below, or give me a thumbs up or a like or something. Give me some sort of sign that you're out there. As I put time into these lessons, it would encourage me if I knew there were at least a few of you out there that are interested in keeping up with the lessons when they come out and being notified and so on. So I need a little encouragement, I guess, if you're out there listening. But today is such an important question. Okay, what are Hebrew diacritics? All right. Hebrew diacritics. Okay, so diacritics in linguistics are these little dots that you see and little markings all around, above and below. There's a little mark above and below, letting the reader know how to pronounce this Hebrew. So this is Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, Bereshit, right? And so Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, created God the heavens and the earth. Okay, so we pronounce biblical Hebrew, if you're following the diacritics of the text we have today. You're going to learn that those two little vertical dots tell you what vowel sound to make after the bet, and the same thing with those two horizontal dots. And all of these Nikkud have they're called Nikkud, and they all have different names. Nikkud, Nikkud. If you just type that into, let's just say, Wikipedia, and here you can see it says in Hebrew orthography, Nikkud. Okay, there it is in Hebrew, Nikkud. They're dotting or pointing is what it means in Hebrew, or Nikot, Nikkudot. It's hard to see. And it's a system of diacritical. There's our word, diacritical signs used to represent vowels or to distinguish between alternative pronunciations of letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Okay, so there are different pronunciations of the Hebrew alphabet. Several such diacritical systems were developed in the early Middle Ages, and the most widespread system, and the only one still used to a significant degree today, was created by the Masoretes of Tiberias in the second half of the first millennium AD in the land of Israel. You can see your Masoretic text, Tiberian Hebrew. Okay, so Nikkud then are little diacritical marks. Here they are over here. And if you go to Wikipedia, you can click on each one of these, and it'll take you to what that mark is and what sounds it makes. Okay. But what's interesting here is that these Nikkud came from the Masoretes of Tiberias, but there were other diacritical systems in the early Middle Ages. All right. So who are the Masoretes, and what's this all about? Well, so there we go again. Here's a picture of all the Nikkud under Bereshit. And they're telling the reader all kinds of different ways, how to pronounce all of this, basically, and other things too. Like in some places, it'll tell you cantillation, so how to sort of chant maybe the Psalms or things like that. So a little history on this. So here's Bereshit, by the way, Genesis chapter 1 in its original letters in the Paleo Hebrew. All right, so Bereshit, bara Elohim et Shemaim wa et haaretz. Notice how I pronounced it a little differently. Maybe perhaps the way they may have pronounced it a long time ago, we don't know. But what we do know is that when Adam wrote Genesis chapter 1, Bereshit, or when Moses compiled it, or when David read it, it was written with these older Paleo Hebrew letters. Okay, and the newer letters, the block form modern Hebrew letters, they came into existence during the when Israel went into captivity in Babylon in 586, ultimately, with Daniel and Ezekiel and all of that, and during the maybe 400, 500 years until Christ came, Israel was taken into captivity, and they adopted the Aramaic block form sort of kind of letters. So they took, here's a bet in Paleo Hebrew, the original bet, and then here's bet at the time of Christ, right? So here's bet at the time of David, and here's bet at the time of Christ. So it changed. They changed the letter, but it was still the same sound, ba, right? So, except by the time of Christ, the bet had taken on other sounds besides ba, like va with a v sound, because the Romans had taken over, and in that, maybe some history, I hope, but the Romans had taken over, and they couldn't pronounce the bet, the ba, very well, so they could say a va, though. So today the bet is pronounced maybe with a ba or maybe with a va, and it depends on, you can see that little Nikkud right in the middle of that bet. You see that little dot in there? So it's telling the reader, say that with a hard sound, the bet with a ba. But if that little dot wasn't in there, you would pronounce it with a va, with a v sound. I'm looking really quick to see if I see any. Yeah, so here's way down here. You can see a bet here, and the bet doesn't have the little dot in it as it does up here. And so that is telling the reader to pronounce that bet with a v sound. Okay, uvain. But maybe in David's time it would have been wabain. So, at any rate, there's a point in all this, so hang in there. We're discussing today Hebrew diacritics. How do we pronounce biblical Hebrew? Why is it important, or is it important? And so the Masoretes, the Hamusara, Ba'alai Hamusara, the Masoretes, these were the groups of Jewish rabbis and scholars who kept the Hebrew language from, alive from 300 AD to 1000 AD. Okay? So the Hebrew language as a language used on the streets sort of wasn't used during the Middle Ages. But the rabbis and these really smart scholars called the Masoretes, they kept the Hebrew language safe, and through their manuscripts, and they were very good at transcribing the scriptures and all kinds of other holy documents and different things. So there were three real main schools of Masoretes, though, during that time period that formed. The Tiberian Masoretes and the Jerusalem Masoretes was another school of scholars down in Jerusalem, whereas Tiberian Masoretes were up in the Galilee area. And then the Babylonian Masoretes as well. And so all of these amazing rabbis and scholars, they pronounced biblical Hebrew different. Each school, they all had different diacritical marks. So the ones that we have today, that we were just looking at earlier, are from the Tiberian Masoretes. We saw that on our Wikipedia when we looked up Nikkud. Those Nikkud, or those diacritical marks, are particular to the Tiberian Masoretes. And the Jerusalem Masoretes would have had different marks, and so with the Babylonian Masoretes. But these guys were amazing. They kept the scriptures alive during the Middle Ages, and they preserved the Tanakh well. And around 1000 A.D., there were two manuscripts from the Masoretes in Tiberias that became famous. One of these manuscripts is called the Aleppo Codex. A codex is a written book, and the oldest Hebrew manuscript that we have today is the Aleppo Codex, because it's kept in Aleppo, Syria. But this manuscript was written by a certain guy. You can look it up, what his name is, and he was one of the Masoretes from Tiberias, and so he put diacritical marks into a Tanakh to help a friend, pronounce Hebrew, and so that manuscript it survived all the way today. Although in 1947, the museum it was in got burned, and maybe up to 40% of that manuscript got destroyed. The other really big manuscript of the Tanakh that we have today, the only full extent manuscript that we have today, then, since Aleppo, it used to be, it's a little older than the Leningrad Codex by a few decades, but since it got partly destroyed in the 1900s, the Leningrad Codex, because it's kept in Leningrad, right? It is now the oldest Hebrew manuscript we have by just a little bit, just because we don't have all of the Aleppo Codex anymore. But both of these were really extremely accurate manuscripts that in 1000 AD became really famous in the Jewish communities. And here's just a picture of some of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And because it's interesting, when you go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found in 1947, 1948, but the Dead Sea Scrolls are from 1st century AD, right, and even before that, before Christ as well. There's really old Hebrew manuscripts and religious writings from the Essenes in Qumran, in the Dead Sea area of Israel. But we see from those Dead Sea Scrolls as well that there were different ways of pronouncing Hebrew in the time of the Essenes in the 1st century AD. There's all kinds of different diacritical marks in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which shows that in the 1st century AD, or in the time of Christ, there was a little bit of freedom in how you'd pronounce Hebrew. There was a little bit of freedom in it. And different scholars pronounced it a little bit differently, just like you pronounce English a little bit differently today. Is it garage or is it garage, right? Is it controversy or is it controversy? Aluminum or aluminium. Okay, so you know, which one's right and which one's wrong is sort of the way Hebrew might have been in the 1st century AD. But then there was a famous sage, Maimonides, who lived around 1200, you know, AD, okay, or in the 1100s or 1200s AD, and he lived in Cairo, Egypt. He became really famous rabbi and scholar, and he's affectionately called Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. Maimonides is a, you know, sort of a nickname for him. He was a leading Jewish scholar in 1138 to 1204 AD. Okay, well, he endorsed the Masoretes and Tiberius and their diacritical marks on their Hebrew manuscripts for the Tanakh. And when he endorsed their diacritical you know, markings, that Aleppo Codex was the one he was reading, and when he endorsed that very fine manuscript, it became almost halakha, so almost law, that in the Jewish communities, the only, you know, manuscript, the only Bible that was allowed was that Aleppo Codex from the Masoretes and Tiberius. So if you had a manuscript from the Masoretes in Jerusalem or Babylon, by the time, you know, a few hundred years after 1000 AD, you know, those manuscripts would not have been widely accepted in the Jewish communities. Only the Tiberian manuscripts, because Maimonides had endorsed it, and everybody looked up to this amazing man so much that it became like almost Jewish law in the Jewish community to pronounce Hebrew the way the Masoretes and Tiberius did, and you weren't, and you still aren't today, really encouraged to pronounce it, you know, differently. So, and by the way, if you are Jewish and listening, I encourage you to listen to your rabbis, you know, and pronounce Hebrew only the way the manuscripts have it today, the Nikkud today, and honor your leaders. And it's a beautiful way to pronounce biblical Hebrew, and I love it, and we can learn so much, you know, from it. However, like for us Westernized Christians, as we're learning biblical Hebrew and trying to, you know, learn from all the amazing Jewish people and scholars, you know, we have to start almost like little children, right? We have to come to the language a little differently, and we have the freedom to, we believe, because, you know, we're not under the rabbi's authority. We're under our rabbi's authority. Yeshua HaMashiach Yisrael is what we believe, humbly. Kum min hamevet, he was risen from the dead, and we're waiting for him to return. But you know, we can still learn from the amazing Jewish people who know the language so amazing, and we don't. But we have to simplify it, and we have to be able to maybe pronounce it the way David would have, or something, or at least try to, so we can learn the language, because it simplifies it when you can pronounce it some other ways, so that the student can learn. So Maimonides, he was Sephardic. He endorsed the Aleppo Codex in his day. So fast forward to Eliezer ben Yehuda. Eliezer ben Yehuda lived in the 18 and 1900s, and he was the father of modern Hebrew during the Zionist movement that began in the 1800s under Theodor Herzl, who had started encouraging Jews everywhere to move back to Israel. And Eliezer ben Yehuda was influenced by Herzl, and he was an amazing scholar, and he lived in Israel, and he basically, long story short, please look him up, he brought back Hebrew to the streets for the first time in a very long time. It's since since 300 A.D. He revived the Hebrew language using the Tanakh and using religious manuscripts and other Semitic ancient languages of the time. He revived the Hebrew language so that people would speak it in Israel when they came back to the Promised Land. When they did Aliyah, they would have their own national language as well, Hebrew. And it took off. It took off, as you can see today. The Jewish people in Israel today and around the world, they're speaking modern Hebrew because of Eliezer ben Yehuda. That's it. He's the one who brought it back. And the way they pronounce modern Hebrew today is a little bit different than biblical Hebrew. They should both sound a little bit different, sort of like when we speak, Shakespearean English versus, English in Mississippi versus English in California versus English in London, in Australia and New Zealand and so on. So it's different depending on where you live and all of that. So what's the point here in all of this? The point is, as you're learning Hebrew, biblical Hebrew, if you're a Christian and you want to learn biblical Hebrew, it can be pronounced with variations. Adam spoke it a little differently than Noah, and Noah a little differently than David, and David a little differently than Jesus, right? And Jesus a little bit differently than the way it's spoken today on the streets in Israel. All of these ways are correct. There's no right or wrong, but it is a fact that Hebrew is a living language that's grown over millennia, and it has been pronounced differently over those millennia. And studying those different pronunciations, perhaps the way David may have pronounced his name, for instance. So Dalet, it's not a very good Dalet, but it's a Dalet, and then a Vav, and then a Dalet. But the Vav in David's time was not pronounced with a Va. That came 500 years later, or even 700 years later with the Romans. They pronounced this wa sound from the Hebrews and from the Phoenicians and from the Semitic peoples. They pronounced that wa sound with a va. And and that's where we get our W today and our U and our V. It's a fascinating history. Look up, where did the va sound come from? And it'll tie back to this Hebrew letter, the Vav, but in David's time it was probably pronounced with a wa instead of a W sound. So his name would have been, as funny as this sounds, Dawad or Daweed. But the Vav, after the Roman conquest, before the time of Christ, began to be pronounced with a Va, and so David or Davad would be the way Jesus pronounced it. Kind of interesting. So the point in all of this is that we are going to be free to study the Hebrew language in a simple form, to break down the language as best we can. And actually, if you look at Paleo Hebrew and how it might have been pronounced in the time of David, for instance, it's simpler. It doesn't have as many vowel sounds, and it's easier for the Western Christian to learn. And then as you grow in it, you will incorporate the Nikkud from the Tiberian Masoretes, and from the time of Maimonides, and the diacritical marks that the Hebrew communities mostly use today. You'll be able to learn from them and grow in it. But first you have to sort of start off like a child. And a child, when he speaks a language, he's not afraid to just kind of go for it. His parents know he didn't say that exactly right, but they knew exactly what he meant. And then as the child grows and he's free and he's not embarrassed to just talk the language, he gets better and better at it. And so that's how we are too. We're simple, and we love biblical Hebrew. We love God's word, and we want to We want the Word of God to grow in our hearts, and so we pray that would happen more on this channel and in future lessons. I hope you have a great day. Please comment below, or if you have any thoughts on any of this, I'd be anxious to hear. Yaverechacha Adonai vayishemrecha. May the Lord bless you and keep you.